Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into the opulent halls of Stockholm's royal palace in 1654, where candles flicker against gilded walls and the scent of winter pine drifts through diamond-paned windows. You're witnessing one of history's most shocking moments, a young queen standing before her stunned court, her voice steady as steel as she speaks words that will echo through centuries. The rustle of silk gowns and the sharp intake of breath from Europe's most powerful nobles fills the air as Christina of Sweden does the unthinkable. She says no. Not just to marriage, but to everything her world expected of her. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why some people choose freedom over security, even when it cost them everything. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to let me know where and when you started watching this video, or maybe share what draws you to these historical tales that help you drift into peaceful sleep. Your support means the world to creators like me who love bringing these forgotten stories back to life. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of centuries pressing down as you stand in that throne room, watching 28-year-old Christina deliver her abdication speech. Her pale blue eyes sweep across faces frozen in disbelief. These are men who've spent years planning her marriage, negotiating treaties, arranging alliances that would secure Sweden's future. But Christina has other plans. You can almost taste the metallic tension in the air as she announces she's renouncing not just the crown, but the very idea that a woman's worth lies in her ability to produce heirs. The historical record shows that Christina's abdication was unprecedented in European royal history. Never before had a monarch voluntarily stepped down simply to avoid marriage. But you're witnessing something deeper than political rebellion. You're seeing a woman choosing authenticity over expectation, personal truth over public duty. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Here was Sweden's most powerful person declaring herself powerless to live the life others demanded. You notice how Christina's voice never wavers as she speaks, even as her courtiers shift uncomfortably in their elaborate court dress. She's wearing men's clothing again, something that scandalized proper society but felt natural to her. The fabric of her doublet catches the candlelight as she gestures, emphasizing each carefully chosen word. This isn't a spontaneous outburst. This is the culmination of years of careful planning, of midnight conversations with herself about what kind of life she actually wants to live. The room itself tells a story of power about to be abandoned. You can see the massive oil paintings depicting Christina's ancestors, warrior kings and queens who conquered territories and expanded empires. Their painted eyes seem to watch disapprovingly as their descendant prepares to undo everything they built. The golden lion of Sweden gleams from every surface, carved into chair backs, woven into tapestries, hammered into the very crown that Christina will soon remove from her head forever. What makes this moment even more extraordinary is the context you're observing. Sweden in 1654 was at the height of its power, controlling vast territories across northern Europe, and the 30 Years' War had ended just 6 years earlier, leaving Sweden as one of Europe's dominant military forces. Christina inherited this legacy from her father, the legendary warrior King Gustavus Adolphus, who died in battle when she was only 6 years old. You can feel the weight of that inheritance pressing down on her shoulders as she speaks. The foreign ambassadors in attendance are frantically scribbling notes. Knowing this, dispatches will reach royal courts across Europe within weeks. The French ambassador keeps glancing toward the door as if considering whether to flee and report this catastrophe immediately. The Spanish representative looks positively gleeful. One less Protestant power to worry about. But the papal nuncio maintains careful neutrality, though you catch him making subtle signs of the cross when he thinks no one is looking. But here's where the story gets deliciously complex. Christina isn't just rejecting marriage, she's rejecting the entire social contract that made her queen possible in the first place. You're watching someone deconstruct the very foundation of their own power, piece by careful piece. It's like watching someone voluntarily demolish their own castle because they've decided they'd rather live in a tent. The metaphor becomes almost literal as you observe Christina systematically transferring each royal prerogative to her chosen successor, her cousin Charles Gustave. The quirky detail that most people miss is that Christina had been secretly learning to write with her left hand for months before the abdication. Why? Because she knew she'd need to sign thousands of documents transferring power, and she wanted the physical act of signing to feel different, foreign, like she was literally becoming someone else with each stroke of the pen. You can see her flexing her fingers now, preparing for the signing ceremony that will make her abdication official. The psychological transformation she's undergone is literally embodied in this simple change of handwriting. You catch glimpses of the carefully orchestrated theatre surrounding this moment. Christina's closest advisors knew this was coming, but they've maintained the fiction of surprise to protect themselves politically. The timing isn't accidental either. It's the feast day of St. Lucia, the virgin martyr who chose death over marriage. Christina appreciates symbolic gestures, and this one cuts deep into the religious consciousness of everyone present. Historians still argue whether Christina's rejection of marriage was motivated by religious conviction, political calculation, or personal inclination toward relationships that defied conventional expectations. The truth, as you're witnessing it unfold, seems to encompass all of these possibilities and more. She's not just saying no to one particular suitor, she's saying no to the entire institution of royal marriage as a tool of statecraft. You can smell the wax from dozens of seals that will soon authenticate the documents scattered across the ornate table beside the throne. Each seal represents another aspect of power she's willingly surrendering. Control over armies, taxation rights, judicial authority, the ability to make war or peace. But you also sense something else in the air. Relief. For the first time in years, Christina's shoulders aren't rigid with the burden of expectation she never asked to carry. The Swedish nobles around you are calculating frantically. What does this mean for their own positions? How will neighbouring kingdoms react? Will there be civil war? But Christina seems almost serene, as if she's finally aligned her outer life with her inner truth. You're witnessing what might be history's most expensive act of self-actualization, and the price tag includes an entire kingdom. As the ceremony continues, you realize you're not just observing a political transition, you're watching the birth of a new kind of person and someone who chose personal authenticity over societal approval, individual freedom over institutional power. Christina is about to become something unprecedented. A former queen, a woman without a country, someone who said no to everything her world offered and decided to create her own path instead. The candles flicker lower as the night deepens, and you can see the future stretching ahead of Christina like an uncharted map. She has no idea what waits for her in exile, no guarantee that her gamble will pay off, But in this moment, surrounded by the trappings of power she's about to abandon, she looks more royal than she ever has before. You step back in time 22 years earlier, into the nurseries of Stockholm's royal palace, where a 6-year-old girl refuses to wear the dress her governess has laid out for her. The morning light streaming through frost-covered windows illuminates young Christina's determined face as she crosses her arms and declares she'll only wear breeches like the boys in the stable yard. This isn't childish defiance, it's the first glimpse of a personality that will reshape European history through the simple act of saying no. The transformation of Christina from crown princess to royal rebel began the moment her father died on a German battlefield in 1632. You can feel the palace atmosphere shift as news of Gustavus Adolphus's death reaches Stockholm. Suddenly, this small girl becomes the most important person in Sweden, and everyone around her begins treating her not like a child, but like a future king. The distinction matters more than you might expect, because that's exactly how Christina begins to see herself. You watch as her tutors, initially confused about how to educate a female heir, make a decision that will echo through centuries. They'll give her the same education they would provide a male ruler. This means Latin and Greek instead of embroidery, military strategy instead of music lessons, philosophy instead of deportment. The irony is delicious. In trying to prepare Christina to rule effectively, they're actually preparing her to reject the very foundations of female royal duty. The Council of Regents overseeing her education includes some of Europe's most progressive thinkers, men who genuinely believe that intellectual ability transcends gender. You can observe their heated debates about curriculum as they argue over whether to include advanced mathematics or focus more heavily on classical rhetoric. They settle on both, creating an educational program that would challenge most university students. Christina, barely old enough to read, absorbs it all with frightening intensity. Her primary tutor, Johannes Mathieu, quickly realizes he's dealing with an exceptional intellect. You can observe their morning lessons where 8-year-old Christina debates theological points with the intensity of a university student. She devours Tacitus and Seneca, memorizes vast passages of Virgil, and begins corresponding with European scholars before she's even learned to manage her temper. The library becomes her sanctuary, and knowledge becomes her rebellion. The physical space of her education tells its own story. You can see how her tutors gradually move her lessons from the traditional feminine spaces of the palace, the solar, the music room, the chapel, into decidedly masculine territories. Soon she's studying military maps in the war room, practicing rhetoric in the council chamber, and learning statecraft in the very throne room where she'll eventually abdicate. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone, least of all on Christina herself, but here's where the story takes a fascinating twist that most historians gloss over. Christina wasn't just intellectually precocious, she was physically fearless in ways that terrified her courtiers. You can see her at age 10, shinning up the palace's tallest towers just to prove she could, or challenging the teenage sons of nobles to sword fights in the courtyard. She rides her horse like a cavalry officer and practices archery until her fingers bleed. This isn't tomboyish behaviour, Beldi. This is someone literally embodying the masculine role she's been taught to fulfill. Her fencing master, a grizzled veteran of her father's campaigns, initially protests when ordered to train the young princess. But within months, you can watch him genuinely struggling to keep up with her aggressive, unconventional style. Christina doesn't fight like someone playing at swordplay, she fights like someone preparing for actual combat. The metaphor extends beyond the physical. She's learning to fight every battle as if her life depends on it. The Swedish court watches this transformation with growing unease. You can sense the whispered conversations in corridors as nobles begin to worry about their future queen's unconventional development. The female courtiers are particularly disturbed. Here's a girl who shows no interest in the skills they've spent lifetimes perfecting, who seems to view traditional feminine accomplishments with something approaching contempt. Their disapproval only strengthens Christina's resolve to chart her own course. Christina's relationship with her mother, Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, becomes increasingly strained during these formative years. You observe painful dinner scenes where the Queen Mother tries desperately to interest her daughter in appropriate feminine pursuits, only to watch Christina escape to the library or the stables at the first opportunity. The generational conflict isn't just personal, it represents two entirely different visions of what a woman can be. The Queen Mother's grief over her husband's death has turned into an obsessive melancholy that Christina finds suffocating. You can see the young princess watching her mother's theatrical displays of mourning with growing impatience and disgust. Maria Eleonora keeps Gustavus Adolphus's heart in a golden casket, talks to his portrait for hours, and insists that Christina should dedicate her life to preserving his memory through marriage and motherhood. Christina draws exactly the opposite conclusion, that life is too short to waste on anyone else's expectations. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's psychological development is her obsession with ancient Roman history, specifically the stories of female rulers who defied gender expectations. You can find her at age 12, reading about Livia and Agrippina by candlelight, taking notes on how imperial women wielded power behind the scenes. But Christina isn't content with behind-the-scenes influence. She wants the real thing, the visual authority that traditionally belongs to men. Her collection of books grows into something unprecedented for a royal woman. You can see her personal library expanding to include works that would raise eyebrows in any court, philosophical treatises questioning divine right, historical accounts of successful female rulers, even some carefully hidden texts that challenge religious orthodoxy. She's not just reading for entertainment, she's researching alternatives to the life everyone expects her to live. Her formal education expands to include subjects no European princess had ever studied: military engineering, statecraft, economic theory, and diplomatic protocol. You watch as teenage Christina masters the art of treaty negotiation by practicing with her tutors, learning to pass the subtle language of international agreements. She's being trained to think like a king, and the training works almost too well. Oh yeah. The linguistic dimension of her education proves particularly crucial. Christina becomes fluent in 7 languages, allowing her to correspond directly with scholars and rulers across Europe without relying on translators or intermediaries. You can observe her switching effortlessly between Swedish, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Latin, and even some Greek during a single conversation, using each language to access different intellectual traditions and ways of thinking about power. Historians still argue whether Christina's early rejection of traditional feminine roles was a conscious choice or simply her natural personality asserting itself. The evidence suggests both factors played a role. She had an innately rebellious temperament that was amplified by an education designed to make her think independently. You can see how each lesson in classical philosophy, or political theory, reinforces her growing conviction that conventional expectations are simply another form of tyranny to be overcome. The international dimension of Christina's education also shapes her rebellious nature. She corresponds with scholars across Europe, including several who challenge traditional religious and social assumptions. Her letters from this period reveal a mind that questions everything, not just political authority, but religious doctrine, social hierarchies, and gender roles. You're watching the intellectual foundations being laid for her eventual abdication. Perhaps most significantly, you observe how Christina begins to construct an alternative vision of royal authority during these teenage years. Instead of seeing queenship as a role that requires marriage and motherhood, she envisions it as an opportunity for intellectual and artistic patronage. She starts collecting books and artifacts, planning the kind of court she wants to create, one based on merit and learning rather than hereditary privilege and reproductive duty. Her coming-of-age ceremony at 18 becomes a perfect symbol of her transformed identity. You can see her standing before the Swedish Parliament, dressed in clothing that splits the difference between male and female court dress, delivering a speech in Latin that demonstrates her classical education while subtly challenging traditional assumptions about female leadership. The assembled nobles applaud, but you can sense their underlying discomfort with this hybrid creature they've helped create. You find yourself in the private chambers of Christina's advisors as the year 1649 dawns, watching faces etched with worry as they huddle around maps scattered across an oak table. The candlelight flickers across documents bearing the seals of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, each one containing marriage proposals that grow more insistent with every passing month. 23-year-old Christina has been queen in her own right for 3 years now, and the pressure to secure the succession through marriage has reached a fever pitch that threatens to consume everything in its path. The mathematics of royal succession weighs heavily on everyone's minds except, it seems, Christina's own. You can see Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna's weathered hands tracing bloodlines on genealogical charts, calculating the political cost of each potential alliance. The Vasa dynasty that Christina represents has ruled Sweden for over a century, but she remains the last direct heir. Without children, the crown will pass to her cousin Charles Gustav, a competent man, but not one who commands the same international respect that Christina has cultivated through her remarkable intellect and diplomatic skills. The foreign marriage proposals arrive weekly now, each one more elaborate than the last. You can observe Christina's secretary reading aloud from letters that promise everything from vast dowries to military alliances that would make Sweden the dominant power in Northern Europe. The Habsburg Archduke Leopold offers not just marriage, but a pathway to the Holy Roman Empire. The French present their young Louis IV as a match that would unite two of Europe's most influential Protestant kingdoms. Even the distant Spanish court, despite religious differences, hints at possibilities that would reshape the balance of continental power. But you notice something peculiar about Christina's reaction to each proposal. She listens with the detached interest of someone studying chess problems, rather than considering her own future. Her questions focus on political implications rather than personal compatibility. She wants to know about territorial concessions, trade agreements, military obligations. When asked about her preferences regarding potential husbands, she redirects the conversation to matters of statecraft with the skill of a seasoned diplomat avoiding a trap. The pressure intensifies when pregnancy rumours begin circulating about other European queens. You can feel the collective anxiety of the Swedish court as news arrives that the Queen of France has delivered another son, that the Empress has given birth to a healthy Archduke. Each royal birth elsewhere serves as an implicit criticism of Christina's continuing unmarried state. The whispers in palace corridors grow louder. What kind of queen values her personal preferences over her dynastic obligations? The Parliament, or Riksdag, begins making increasingly direct appeals for Christina to marry. You can observe their formal sessions where representatives from all 4 estates, nobility, clergy, burghers, and peasants, unite in urging their queen to secure the succession. Their arguments are carefully crafted to appeal to her sense of duty. Sweden needs stability. The people deserve certainty about their future. The kingdom's enemies are watching for signs of weakness. The irony is that their very eloquence demonstrates the sophisticated political culture that Christina's own education and leadership have fostered. Behind closed doors, you witness more private conversations that reveal the depth of concern among Christina's closest advisors. Oxenstierna, now in his 70s and increasingly frail, speaks openly about his fears for Sweden's future. He served 3 generations of Vasa rulers and understands better than anyone how precarious royal authority can become without clear succession. His late-night conversations with other council members take on an almost desperate quality as they search for ways to convince their brilliant but stubborn queen to accept reality. The quirky aspect of this mounting pressure campaign is Christina's response. She begins hosting elaborate dinner parties where she invites her councillors to debate the philosophical foundations of monarchy itself. You can see her orchestrating these conversations with devilish precision, leading distinguished statesmen into abstract discussions about whether hereditary rule is actually the best form of government. Her guests find themselves arguing against their own fundamental beliefs, while Christina listens with barely concealed amusement. International observers are beginning to notice Sweden's succession crisis. You can read diplomatic dispatches that analyse Christina's unmarried state as a strategic weakness that neighbouring powers might exploit. The Danish court, smarting from military defeats, openly speculates about Swedish instability. Russian diplomats probe carefully for signs that Sweden's military might is vulnerable to internal discord. Even distant courts that have no direct interest in Scandinavian politics begin factoring Christina's personal decisions into their own strategic calculations. The religious dimension adds another layer of complexity to the marriage trap. As a Lutheran queen, Christina's choice of husband will have profound implications for Sweden's role in the ongoing conflicts between Protestant and Catholic Europe. You can observe how carefully foreign ambassadors frame their proposals to emphasize religious compatibility or, alternatively, the strategic advantages of cross-confessional alliances. Each conversation becomes a theological as well as political minefield. Historians still argue whether Christina's resistance to marriage at this point reflected genuine personal conviction or strategic delay, while she planned her eventual abdication. The evidence suggests she was already contemplating radical alternatives to conventional queenship, but she couldn't reveal these thoughts without triggering a constitutional crisis. You can see her walking a careful line between outright refusal and encouragement, buying time while she develops her secret plans. The economic pressure proves almost as significant as the political concerns. Sweden's recent military successes have been expensive, and the kingdom needs the financial stability that strategic marriages typically provide. You can examine the detailed budget analyses that Oxenstierna presents to Christina, showing how marriage alliances traditionally bring not just dowries but ongoing trade relationships that strengthen national economies. Christina studies these documents with genuine interest, but her questions focus on alternative revenue sources, rather than acceptance of marriage as the solution. The most poignant moments occur when you observe Christina alone in her private apartments, surrounded by the portraits of her royal ancestors. These painted faces seem to watch accusingly as she paces before them, wearing men's clothing that scandalized the court but felt natural to her. You can almost hear the silent conversation she has with these images, particularly with her father, whose early death created the very situation she now struggles to resolve. The trap tightens further when Christina's cousin Charles Gustav begins his own marriage negotiations. The irony isn't lost on anyone. If Christina refuses to marry and produce heirs, Charles Gustav becomes the succession insurance policy. But his own marriage would create competing claims and potential dynastic conflicts that could tear Sweden apart. You can sense the growing urgency as councillors realise they're running out of time to resolve this gracefully. Foreign courts begin adjusting their diplomatic strategies as Christina's resistance becomes apparent. Instead of formal proposals, they start sending young, charismatic ambassadors who might personally appeal to the Queen. You can watch these handsome, accomplished men arriving in Stockholm with instructions to charm their way into a royal marriage. Christina receives them with perfect courtesy and intellectual engagement, but you can see her treating each interaction as an entertaining diversion rather than a serious courtship. The pressure reaches its crescendo when several European powers begin making veiled threats about Sweden's diplomatic isolation if Christina continues to refuse marriage. You can read between the lines of formal communications that hint at trade disruptions, military alliance shifts, even potential succession disputes if Sweden appears weak or unstable. The very success of her father's military campaigns has made Sweden so prominent that Christina's personal decisions now affect the entire European balance of power. As 1653 approaches, you can feel the walls closing in around Christina. Every conversation, every council meeting, every diplomatic reception reinforces the same message. She must marry, she must produce heirs, she must conform to the expectations that come with royal birth. But you also sense something else building in her response to this pressure. Not surrender, but a growing determination to find a completely different escape route. You slip through the shadows of Stockholm's royal palace as midnight approaches, drawn by the soft glow of candlelight emanating from Christina's private study. The heavy oak door stands slightly ajar, and you can hear the low murmur of voices engaged in intense philosophical debate. This is where the real transformation happens, not in the formal throne room or council chambers, but in these secret midnight gatherings where Christina surrounds herself with Europe's most radical thinkers and begins questioning the very foundations of her own existence. The scene that unfolds before you reveals a side of Christina that her public persona carefully conceals. Gone are the ceremonial robes and crown. Instead, she's dressed in the simple dark clothing she prefers for serious intellectual work. Around her gather an extraordinary collection of minds, philosophers, theologians, scientists and artists who've travelled from across Europe to participate in what amounts to a clandestine university operating within the royal palace. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and dangerous ideas. Tonight's discussion centres on a question that would horrify Christina's councillors if they knew: whether individual conscience should supersede social obligation. You can see René Descartes himself, now in his final years, gesturing emphatically as he argues that rational thought must be the ultimate authority in human affairs. His presence in Stockholm represents Christina's growing reputation as Europe's most intellectually sophisticated monarch, but also her increasing attraction to ideas that fundamentally challenge royal duty. The quirky detail that most historians miss is Christina's habit of serving these gatherings herself, refusing to allow servants into the room during these sensitive conversations. You can watch her moving between her guests with wine and simple food, creating an atmosphere of equality that would be impossible in formal court settings. This isn't just hospitality, it's a deliberate rejection of the hierarchical relationships that define her daily existence as queen. You observe how Christina orchestrates these conversations with subtle skill, introducing topics that push her guests toward increasingly radical conclusions. Tonight she poses a seemingly innocent question about whether humans have obligations they didn't choose to accept. The discussion quickly moves toward dangerous territory as her companions begin questioning hereditary monarchy, religious authority, and social conventions that trap individuals in roles they never selected for themselves. The French philosopher Pierre Gassendi leans forward in his chair, his eyes bright with intellectual excitement as he describes his atomistic theories. According to his vision, human beings are simply collections of material particles temporarily organized into conscious forms. The implications are revolutionary. If humans are just matter in motion, then concepts like divine right and inherited obligation become meaningless superstitions. You can see Christina absorbing these ideas with the intensity of someone discovering the philosophical tools she needs to justify choices she's already contemplating. But the most influential presence in these gatherings isn't any single philosopher. It's the collective atmosphere of intellectual freedom that Christina has cultivated. You can sense how liberating these conversations feel to someone who spends most of her time navigating the rigid protocols of royal life. Here, ideas matter more than titles, arguments more than ancestry. For a few hours each night, Christina can experience what it might feel like to be judged purely on the merit of her thoughts, rather than the accident of her birth. The religious discussions prove particularly transformative. You can observe Christina engaging with theologians who question Protestant orthodoxy from multiple directions. Some argue for a more personal, mystical approach to spirituality that transcends institutional religious boundaries. Others present sophisticated defences of Catholic theology that challenge her Lutheran upbringing. Still others push toward philosophical positions that minimize the importance of organized religion entirely. Each perspective offers Christina a different pathway away from the confessional constraints that define Swedish royal identity. Historians still argue whether these midnight conversations represented genuine intellectual curiosity or calculated preparation for Christina's eventual conversion to Catholicism. The evidence suggests both motivations were operating simultaneously. She was genuinely drawn to philosophical speculation, while also researching practical alternatives to her current situation. You can see her taking careful mental notes during theological debates, storing away arguments she might need later to justify radical personal decisions. The scientific discussions add another dimension to Christina's intellectual transformation. You can watch her engaging with natural philosophers who describe a universe governed by mathematical laws rather than divine intervention. These conversations don't necessarily undermine religious faith, but they do suggest that rational investigation can reveal truths hidden from traditional authorities. For someone questioning inherited wisdom, this scientific approach offers a powerful model for independent thinking. The artistic dimension of these gatherings proves equally important in shaping Christina's evolving self-image. You can observe poets and painters who've rejected conventional themes in favor of personal expression and individual vision. Their work demonstrates that creative people can forge their own paths rather than simply fulfilling social expectations. Christina, who's always been drawn to artistic patronage, begins to see parallels between artistic independence and the personal freedom she craves. The gender dynamics of these conversations reveal fascinating tensions in Christina's thinking. Most of her midnight guests are men, reflecting the reality that European intellectual life remains largely masculine territory. But you can see how Christina uses her royal authority to command respect and attention that would be denied to other women. She's simultaneously benefiting from and rebelling against the same monarchical system that gives her the power to host these radical discussions. The political implications of these philosophical investigations become increasingly apparent as the conversations continue night after night. You can hear Christina and her guests developing sophisticated critiques of hereditary authority, divine right theory, and the social contracts that bind individuals to roles they didn't choose. These aren't abstract academic exercises, they're the intellectual foundations for the most dramatic royal abdication in European history. The psychological transformation occurring during these midnight sessions proves as significant as the intellectual development. You can observe Christina gradually shedding the psychological constraints that royal education typically imposes. Where most monarchs learn to identify their personal interests with state interests, Christina begins to see these as potentially conflicting loyalties that individuals must resolve through rational choice rather than inherited obligation. The international character of these gatherings also broadens Christina's perspective beyond Swedish concerns. You can see her engaging with intellectuals who describe different political systems, alternative religious practices, and diverse approaches to individual fulfillment. These conversations don't just challenge Swedish orthodoxy, they reveal entire worlds of possibility that exist beyond the traditional boundaries of royal life. The most dangerous discussions focus on the nature of personal identity itself. You can listen as Christina and her companions explore whether individuals are defined by their social roles or possess some essential selfhood that transcends external expectations. For someone struggling with the gap between her inner life and public persona, these philosophical investigations offer both validation and practical guidance for navigating identity conflicts. The secrecy surrounding these gatherings adds to their psychological impact. You can sense the thrill Christina experiences in maintaining intellectual relationships that her counselors would consider treasonous. The very act of concealing these conversations from official oversight represents a form of rebellion that prepares her for larger acts of defiance against royal expectations. As dawn approaches and the philosophers finally depart, you can see Christina remaining alone in her study, surrounded by books and ideas that have fundamentally altered her understanding of herself and her options. The queen who emerges from these midnight conversations is no longer someone struggling against incomprehensible constraints, but someone who's developed sophisticated intellectual justifications for the radical choices she's preparing to make. The philosophical foundations for abdication are being carefully laid, one dangerous conversation at a time. You find yourself in the shadowy alcoves of Stockholm's royal chapel during the early hours of morning, watching Christina kneel before a small crucifix that she's hidden behind a collection of Lutheran prayer books. The irony of the scene strikes you immediately. Sweden's Protestant queen secretly contemplating Catholic imagery while her kingdom sleeps, unaware that their monarch is flirting with what they would consider the ultimate betrayal. The soft morning light filtering through stained glass windows illuminates her face as she traces the outline of the cross with her finger, and you can sense the dangerous thoughts taking root in her mind. The Catholic whispers began innocuously enough. During those midnight philosophical gatherings you witnessed earlier, you can recall the moment when a visiting Italian scholar casually mentioned the intellectual sophistication of Jesuit theology, praising their approach to reconciling reason with faith. Christina's eyes had lit up with genuine curiosity. Here was a tradition that embraced the very philosophical investigation she found so compelling, rather than viewing them as threats to religious authority. The historical context makes Christina's Catholic flirtation particularly scandalous. Sweden had emerged as Protestant Europe military champion during the 30 Years' War, with her father Gustavus Adolphus literally dying to defend Lutheran territories against Catholic Habsburg expansion. You can feel the weight of this legacy pressing down on Christina as she explores ideas that would horrify the generals and ministers who built their careers fighting Catholic powers. But Christina's attraction to Catholicism isn't purely intellectual, it's also deeply personal and psychological. You can observe her growing frustration with Lutheran emphasis on predestination and divine will, doctrines that seem to lock individuals into roles determined before birth. Catholic theology, with its emphasis on free will and personal choice, offers her a religious framework that supports rather than constrains her desire for self-determination. The practical aspects of Christina's Catholic investigation reveal her characteristic thoroughness. You can see her accumulating a secret library of Catholic texts, carefully hidden behind false walls in her private chambers. She's not just reading devotional works, but studying the sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions that Catholic universities have developed over centuries. Her collection includes writings by Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and contemporary Jesuit scholars who've mastered the art of integrating classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. The psychological dimension of her Catholic exploration proves particularly fascinating. You can observe Christina using Catholic mystical traditions to explore aspects of her identity that Lutheran theology doesn't address. The rich tradition of Catholic writing about spiritual friendship, contemplative life, and alternative paths to religious fulfillment speaks directly to someone questioning conventional social expectations. She discovers saints who chose celibacy over marriage, contemplation over worldly engagement, spiritual authority over temporal power. The diplomatic implications of Christina's Catholic interests create layers of secrecy and deception that would impress any spy. You can watch her carefully managing conversations with visiting Catholic dignitaries, asking theological questions that sound like intellectual curiosity rather than personal investigation. She's learned to probe Catholic doctrine while maintaining perfect Lutheran orthodoxy in public, a balancing act that requires extraordinary psychological sophistication. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's deepening Catholic fascination is her secret correspondence with Jesuit missionaries. Using intermediaries and coded language, she begins exchanging letters with Catholic intellectuals across Europe. These conversations start with abstract theological questions, but gradually become more personal as Christina explores whether conversion might offer her a path to the kind of life she actually wants to live. You can sense the growing tension between Christina's public Protestant persona and her private Catholic investigations. Lutheran Sweden has defined itself partly through opposition to Catholic authority, making her exploration feel like not just personal betrayal, but potential treason. The very prayers she's supposed to lead in public worship feel increasingly hollow as she privately contemplates alternative spiritual traditions that seem more aligned with her authentic beliefs. The intellectual appeal of Catholic universities becomes particularly attractive to someone of Christina's scholarly temperament. You can see her correspondence with professors at the Sorbonne and other Catholic institutions, engaging in the kind of sophisticated theological debate that Protestant Sweden simply couldn't offer. These conversations don't just challenge her religious assumptions, they reveal educational and cultural possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of her inherited faith. Historians still argue whether Christina's Catholic interests represented genuine religious conviction or strategic calculation about her political future. The evidence suggests both factors were operating. She was genuinely drawn to Catholic theology, while also recognizing that conversion might provide justification for abandoning her royal duties. You can observe her exploring Catholic doctrine with the same intellectual rigor she applied to political philosophy, treating religious conversion as another form of rational choice rather than mystical experience. The European political context makes Christina's Catholic flirtation even more significant. Catholic powers like France and Spain have been courting Protestant Sweden for decades, hoping to split the Lutheran alliance that threatens Habsburg interests. Christina's private religious investigations could potentially reshape the entire European balance of power, if they led to public conversion and new diplomatic alignments. The personal psychology behind Christina's Catholic attraction reveals deeper conflicts about authority and autonomy. You can see her drawn to Catholic emphasis on individual spiritual development and personal relationship with divine authority, as opposed to Protestant stress on communal worship and social conformity. Catholic mystical traditions offer models of religious life that transcend conventional gender roles and social expectations. The practical consequences of potential conversion weigh heavily on Christina's calculations. You can observe her researching the historical precedents. What happens to Protestant monarchs who convert to Catholicism? The examples aren't encouraging for someone hoping to maintain political power, but they do suggest possibilities for alternative forms of authority and influence that might compensate for lost temporal power. The secret nature of Christina's Catholic investigations creates its own psychological dynamics. You can sense the thrill she experiences in maintaining theological relationships that would horrify her subjects. The very act of concealing religious exploration from Protestant authorities represents a form of spiritual rebellion that prepares her for larger acts of defiance against inherited expectations. The artistic and cultural dimensions of Catholic tradition particularly appeal to Christina's aesthetic sensibilities. You can see her fascination with Catholic approaches to beauty, ceremony, and artistic expression that seem more sophisticated than Protestant austerity. The possibility of participating in rich ceremonial traditions and supporting elaborate artistic projects offers attractive alternatives to the relatively Spartan culture of Lutheran Sweden. The theological discussions with Catholic intellectuals gradually move beyond abstract doctrine toward practical questions about conversion and its consequences. You can observe Christina carefully probing whether Catholic authorities would support a convert who had abdicated royal power for religious reasons. These conversations don't just explore spiritual possibilities, they research practical alternatives to her current impossible situation. The growing disconnect between Christina's public Lutheran duties and private Catholic interests creates increasing psychological strain. You can see her struggling through official Protestant ceremonies while privately practicing Catholic devotional exercises. The duplicity becomes another form of preparation for the larger deception she'll need to orchestrate her eventual escape from royal obligations. As Christina's Catholic investigations deepen, you can sense them becoming part of a larger strategy for personal transformation. Religious conversion offers not just spiritual alternative but social and political justification for abandoning the role she was born to play. The Catholic whispers aren't just about changing faith, they're about changing identity itself, finding religious grounds for the radical personal choices she's preparing to make. You find yourself in the opulent halls of European royal courts as the 1650s unfold, watching an intricate game of diplomatic chess where Christina of Sweden has become the most coveted piece on the board. The morning light streams through the tall windows of the French royal palace at Versailles, as young Louis XIV's ministers debate the strategic advantages of a Swedish marriage alliance. Across the continent in Vienna, Habsburg diplomats calculate how a union with Christina might shift the delicate balance of European power. You're witnessing political maneuvering on a scale that would determine the fate of nations for generations to come. The marriage negotiations surrounding Christina represent more than personal matchmaking. They're geopolitical warfare conducted through carefully orchestrated courtship rituals. You can observe teams of diplomats moving between capitals like pieces on a continental chessboard, each carrying proposals that would fundamentally reshape European alliances. The stakes couldn't be higher. Whoever marries Christina doesn't just gain a queen. They gain access to Sweden's formidable military machine and vast mineral wealth. The French approach proves characteristically sophisticated in its psychological manipulation. You can watch Cardinal Mazarin's agents studying detailed reports about Christina's intellectual interests, her philosophical leanings, her personal quirks and preferences. They're not just offering a political alliance. They're crafting a courtship strategy designed to appeal to her specific personality. The French proposal emphasizes intellectual companionship, promising Christina access to Europe's most advanced universities and philosophical circles if she'll consider their candidate. But the Habsburg counter-strategy reveals even deeper understanding of Christina's psychological vulnerabilities. You can see imperial diplomats emphasizing the religious dimensions of potential marriage, subtly suggesting that union with a Catholic prince might resolve the spiritual conflicts they have somehow detected in her private life. Their intelligence network has clearly identified her secret Catholic investigations, and they're using this knowledge to craft proposals that speak to her hidden desires rather than her public persona. The English approach takes a completely different direction, appealing to Christina's reputation for unconventional thinking. You can observe Commonwealth representatives suggesting that marriage to an English prince would align Sweden with Europe's most progressive political experiment. They're offering not just personal partnership, but participation in creating new forms of government that transcend traditional monarchical limitations. For someone questioning hereditary authority, the English proposal offers tantalizing possibilities for political innovation. The Spanish strategy proves perhaps most psychologically astute in its recognition that Christina might be persuaded through reverse psychology. You can watch Spanish diplomats carefully avoiding direct marriage proposals, while emphasizing the theological sophistication of Spanish Catholic universities. They're betting that someone of Christina's intellectual pride might be more attracted to what seems unattainable than to what's directly offered. The lesser German principalities flood Stockholm with proposals that range from touching to absurd, and you can see Christina's secretary reading aloud from letters that promise everything from vast libraries to private armies, from artistic patronage to religious freedom. Each minor prince seems convinced that the right combination of incentives might win Sweden's extraordinary queen. The sheer vehemence of proposals creates its own diplomatic problems as Christina's court struggles to manage expectations without giving offence. The psychological warfare extends beyond the actual suitors to their supporters and representatives. You can observe a virtual invasion of Stockholm by young, charismatic ambassadors specifically chosen for their potential appeal to Christina's personal tastes. These men aren't just diplomats, they're essentially professional charmers whose mission is to make their political proposals personally irresistible. The result is a royal court filled with accomplished, attractive men competing for the Queen's attention through intellectual conversation and cultural sophistication. The quirky aspect of this diplomatic courtship campaign is Christina's response. She treats each proposal as a fascinating intellectual exercise while completely ignoring its personal implications. You can watch her engaging with marriage ambassadors as if they are presenting abstract philosophical problems rather than life-changing personal decisions. She asks penetrating questions about political theory, religious doctrine, and cultural traditions while seeming genuinely oblivious to the romantic dimensions of their missions. The intelligence gathering surrounding these negotiations becomes increasingly sophisticated, as European powers realize that conventional diplomatic approaches aren't working with Christina. You can see networks of spies and informants developing detailed psychological profiles, trying to identify leverage points that might influence her decision-making. The reports they generate read more like modern psychiatric evaluations than traditional diplomatic assessments. The economic dimensions of the marriage negotiations reveal the immense stakes involved in Christina's choice. You can examine detailed financial proposals that would have made Sweden the wealthiest kingdom in Northern Europe. French offers include not just dowries but ongoing trade concessions that would have revolutionized Swedish commerce. Habsburg proposals promise access to New World silver that could have funded Swedish expansion for centuries. Yet Christina studies these economic inducements with the same detached interest she shows toward the political advantages. Historians still argue whether Christina's apparent indifference to these marriage negotiations reflected genuine disinterest or carefully calculated delay tactics. The evidence suggests she was buying time while developing her secret abdication plans, but her public behavior shows no signs of deception. You can observe her engaging with each diplomatic mission with apparent sincerity while privately moving toward decisions that will make all their efforts irrelevant. The religious complications add another layer to the diplomatic chess game. Protestant powers worry that Christina might be susceptible to Catholic influence through marriage, while Catholic courts hope that the right husband might facilitate her conversion. You can see how carefully each proposal balances religious considerations, trying to appeal to Christina's spiritual interests without alarming her Protestant subjects or triggering intervention from rival powers. The military implications of Christina's marriage choice create their own diplomatic pressures. You can observe Swedish generals and foreign military advisors calculating how different alliances would affect European warfare. A French marriage would create a Protestant coalition capable of challenging Habsburg dominance. A Habsburg union would fundamentally alter the balance between Catholic and Protestant military power. Even minor German alliances could shift regional dynamics in ways that larger powers would find threatening. The cultural dimensions of the courtship campaign reveal fascinating insights into 17th century assumptions about female psychology. You can see how each diplomatic mission approaches Christina through what they assume will appeal to a learned woman: artistic patronage, intellectual companionship, cultural sophistication. Yet their very sophistication demonstrates their fundamental misunderstanding of someone who's already moved beyond conventional frameworks for thinking about marriage and royal duty. The communication networks supporting these negotiations become increasingly complex as European courts coordinate their strategies. You can observe a continental postal system dedicated primarily to intelligence gathering and diplomatic maneuvering around Christina's marriage choice. The sheer resources devoted to influencing one woman's personal decision demonstrate how much European stability depends on the reproductive choices of hereditary monarchs. The psychological pressure on Christina intensifies as she realizes that her marriage decision will inevitably disappoint multiple powerful allies while potentially creating new enemies. You can sense her growing awareness that any choice she makes will have consequences extending far beyond her personal happiness or even Sweden's immediate interests. The weight of continental expectations becomes another factor pushing her toward the radical solution she's secretly developing. The most sophisticated observers begin to detect something unusual in Christina's responses to these elaborate courtship campaigns. You can see experienced diplomats noting her tendency to redirect personal conversations toward abstract questions, her apparent fascination with theoretical political problems rather than practical relationship considerations, but none of them suspect the true reason for her detachment, that she's already planning to escape the entire system that makes their proposals relevant. As the marriage negotiations reach their peak intensity, you can feel the continental political system straining under the pressure of Christina's indecision. Every major European power has invested enormous resources in influencing her choice, and the growing realization that she might not choose any of them creates diplomatic tensions that threaten to destabilize the entire post-war settlement. The woman who said no to marriage is inadvertently saying no to the political assumptions that govern European international relations. You slip into the shadows behind heavy tapestries in Christina's private chambers as autumn 1653 deepens, watching her carefully orchestrate the most elaborate deception in royal history. The candlelight flickers across maps and documents spread across her writing desk as she methodically plans her escape from everything she was born to be. This isn't the impulsive decision of a frustrated young woman. This is the calculated strategy of someone who's spent years preparing for the most dramatic abdication Europe has ever witnessed. The genius of Christina's deception lies in its perfect psychological manipulation of everyone around her. You can observe her during council meetings, playing her role with Oscar-worthy precision as she appears to wrestle with the marriage question, while secretly having already resolved it in a completely different direction. She sighs at appropriate moments, asks for more time to consider various proposals, even requests additional details about potential suitors, all while knowing she'll never marry any of them, because she'll soon be no one's queen to bargain with. The practical preparations for her escape require extraordinary logistical sophistication. You can see her gradually transferring personal funds to intermediaries across Europe, converting Swedish assets into portable wealth that won't depend on royal authority. She's not just planning to abdicate, she's planning to survive financially as a private person in a world where former queens have no established social position. The mathematical precision of her financial planning reveals the same intellectual rigor she applies to philosophical problems. Her correspondence network becomes a masterpiece of strategic communication as Christina maintains different personas for different audiences. You can watch her writing simultaneously to Catholic theologians about spiritual matters, to foreign diplomats about political possibilities, and to her own counsellors about marriage negotiations, each letter carefully crafted to advance her secret agenda while maintaining her public cover. The psychological compartmentalization required for this level of deception would challenge any modern intelligence operators. The most delicate aspect of Christina's great deception involves managing her cousin Charles Gustave, who will inherit the crown after her abdication. You can observe their private conversations where she carefully prepares him for kingship while concealing her true timeline. She's not just abandoning the throne, she's orchestrating a smooth transition that will minimize the political chaos her decision will inevitably create. Her genuine affection for Charles and concern for Sweden's stability add emotional complexity to what might otherwise seem like purely selfish calculation. The religious dimension of her deception proves particularly intricate as Christina uses her apparent spiritual struggles to explain increasingly erratic behaviour. You can see her confiding selected aspects of her Catholic investigations to trusted advisors, framing them as intellectual curiosity rather than preparation for conversion. This partial honesty serves multiple purposes. It explains her distraction from royal duties, while creating a theological justification for the radical choices she's preparing to make. The international implications of Christina's secret planning require her to maintain diplomatic relationships that she knows will be permanently severed by her abdication. You can watch her receiving foreign ambassadors with perfect royal courtesy, while privately calculating how their governments will react to her conversion and exile. She's particularly careful with French representatives, knowing that her eventual flight will likely take her through territories where their protection might prove essential. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's psychological state during this deception period is her habit of practicing different signatures late at night. You can see her experimenting with how to sign her name after abdication. Should she use Christina without royal titles? Christina Alexandra to emphasize her given names rather than inherited position? The seemingly trivial question of post-royal identity reflects deeper anxieties about who she'll become after destroying who she was born to be. Her manipulation of the Swedish court's daily routines becomes increasingly sophisticated as the deception deepens. You can observe how she gradually reduces her participation in ceremonial functions, while increasing her involvement in administrative details that will ease the transition to Charles Gustav's rule. She's simultaneously disengaging from royal performance while ensuring governmental continuity, a balancing act that requires extraordinary political skill. The psychological toll of maintaining this elaborate deception begins to show in subtle ways that only the most observant courtiers notice. You can see Christina's occasional moments of genuine exhaustion when she thinks no one is watching, the brief lapses in her careful performance that reveal the enormous energy required to live so completely divided a life. The strain of being perpetually false to everyone who trusts her adds unexpected emotional weight to what began as an intellectual exercise in personal liberation. Historians still argue whether Christina's deception was morally justified, given its consequences for Swedish political stability and European diplomatic relations. From your perspective as a witness to her planning process, you can see how she wrestles with these ethical dimensions while remaining committed to her chosen course. She's not cavalier about the disruption her choices will cause. She's deeply thoughtful about minimizing harm while refusing to sacrifice her authentic self to others' expectations. The artistic and cultural preparations for her new life reveal Christina's vision of post-royal identity. You can observe her quietly commissioning portable artworks and selecting books that will form the nucleus of her future collection. She's not just planning to survive exiles, she's planning to create a new kind of cultural institution based on intellectual merit rather than hereditary privilege. The scope of her cultural planning suggests someone who sees abdication not as loss, but as opportunity for more authentic forms of influence. The timing of Christina's deception becomes increasingly critical as various marriage negotiations reach decision points. You can see her carefully managing expectations, promising decisions soon while secretly accelerating her abdication preparations. She needs to maintain the fiction of considering marriage long enough to complete her planning, but not so long that disappointed suitors might unite in opposition to whatever alternative she eventually reveals. The legal complexities of abdication require Christina to navigate constitutional questions that have no clear precedents in Swedish law. You can watch her consulting with legal scholars about the proper procedures for voluntary royal succession, framing these inquiries as abstract intellectual curiosity rather than immediate practical necessity. Her questions reveal sophisticated understanding of how to make her abdication legally unassailable, while maintaining the element of surprise that her strategy requires. The most dangerous aspect of Christina's deception involves concealing her Catholic conversion preparations from Protestant Swedish authorities who would consider such investigation treasonous. You can see her using her philosophical gatherings as cover for increasingly specific theological research, gradually building the intellectual foundation for religious conversion while maintaining perfect Lutheran orthodoxy in public. The risk of discovery adds constant tension to every conversation about spiritual matters. The international intelligence networks monitoring Christina's behavior create additional layers of complexity for her deception. You can observe how carefully she manages information flow, ensuring that foreign spies report exactly what she wants them to see while concealing the activities that would trigger premature intervention. She's not just deceiving her own court, she's manipulating the intelligence assessments that European powers use to plan their Swedish strategies. The emotional dimensions of Christina's deception prove particularly challenging, as she maintains close relationships with people she's preparing to abandon. You can see her genuine affection for longtime advisors and servants who have devoted their lives to serving her, knowing that her choices will devastate their careers and personal loyalties. The human cost of her liberation adds moral weight that purely political calculations couldn't capture. As winter approaches and Christina's secret timeline accelerates, you can sense the mounting tension between her public performance and private reality. The Great Deception is nearing its climax, and soon the most carefully orchestrated royal fraud in European history will transform into the most shocking abdication the continent has ever witnessed. The woman who spent months lying to everyone about her intentions is preparing to tell the ultimate truth about who she really wants to be. You stand in the Great Hall of Uppsala Castle on June 6, 1654, as the morning sun streams through ancient windows, illuminating what will become one of history's most extraordinary royal ceremonies. The air crackles with anticipation as Sweden's nobility, foreign ambassadors, and common citizens pack the ornate chamber, expecting to witness a routine ceremonial event. Instead, you're about to observe the moment when Christina of Sweden shatters every expectation about royal duty, dynastic obligation, and the divine right of kings with words that will echo through centuries. The ceremony begins with traditional pomp that masks the revolutionary drama about to unfold. You can see Christina entering the hall wearing the full regalia of Swedish monarchy, the crown of Erik von glinting on her head, the royal orb and sceptre heavy in her hands, the ceremonial sword at her side. She looks every inch the sovereign as she processes toward the throne. But you can detect something different in her bearing. There's a lightness to her step, almost a spring of anticipation, as if she's walking toward freedom rather than fulfilling duty. The assembled crowd represents the entire Swedish social hierarchy, from the highest nobles to representatives of the common estates. You can observe their faces, expectant and respectful, as they prepare to hear what they assume will be a routine address about marriage negotiations or foreign policy. None of them suspect they're about to witness the voluntary destruction of everything their political system represents. The irony is delicious. They've gathered to celebrate royal authority just as their queen prepares to reject it entirely. Christina takes her position on the throne with ceremonial dignity, but you can sense the nervous energy radiating from her advisors. Chancellor Oxenstierna, now visibly frail, watches from his place of honour with eyes that seem to suspect something unprecedented is approaching. The foreign ambassadors lean forward slightly, alert to any hint about marriage decisions that might affect their nation's diplomatic strategies. The tension in the room is palpable, though no one yet understands why. The speech begins conventionally enough, with Christina acknowledging the loyalty of her subjects and the challenges facing the Swedish realm. Her voice carries clearly through the vast hall as she discusses recent military victories, trade negotiations, and administrative reforms. You can see the audience relaxing slightly as the opening minutes follow familiar patterns of royal address. But then her tone shifts, becoming more personal and philosophical, and you can feel the atmosphere beginning to change. The first hint of what's coming emerges when Christina begins discussing the nature of royal service and personal sacrifice. You can observe how carefully she's chosen her words, building toward her revelation with the logical precision of a philosophical argument rather than the emotional appeal of traditional royal rhetoric. She speaks about the relationship between individual conscience and a public duty, about the importance of authentic service over inherited obligation. The more perceptive listeners begin to sense that something unusual is developing. The pivotal moment arrives when Christina stands and begins removing the symbols of royal authority with deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. You can see her lifting the crown from her head with both hands, pausing to let its weight register one final time before setting it carefully on a cushioned table beside the throne. The gesture sends a visible shock through the assembled crowd as people realize they are witnessing something unprecedented in European royal history. The audible gasp that sweeps through the hall when Christina removes the crown creates an almost physical wave of disbelief. You can see faces throughout the crowd shifting from confusion to comprehension to horror as they understand what they're witnessing. This isn't a ceremonial transfer of regalia. This is actual abdication. The voluntary renunciation of divine authority that their entire political system assumes is impossible. The psychological impact on observers who have never questioned hereditary monarchy is almost overwhelming. Christina's explanation of her decision reveals the intellectual sophistication behind what might appear to be an impulsive gesture. You can listen as she articulates a theory of royal service that emphasizes authentic vocation over inherited duty, personal calling over dynastic obligation. Her arguments draw on the philosophical investigations you witnessed during those midnight gatherings, transforming abstract intellectual speculation into practical political action. She's not just abdicating, she's providing a new theoretical framework for understanding royal authority itself. The quirky detail that most historians miss is Christina's insistence on personally handling every aspect of the regalia transfer. You can observe her carefully placing each symbol of authority, crown, scepter, orb, and sword, in precise positions that seem to follow some internal choreography. She's not just renouncing power, she's performing a ritual that transforms royal abdication into a kind of liturgical ceremony. The theatrical dimension adds dignity to what could have been merely shocking. The reaction of foreign diplomats reveals the international implications of Christina's decision. You can see the French ambassador frantically calculating how this affects negotiations for Swedish military support. The Habsburg representative looks genuinely stunned as he realizes that years of careful marriage diplomacy have just become irrelevant. The English observer seems almost impressed by the audacity of Christina's gesture, while the papal nuncio maintains careful neutrality despite what must be intense curiosity about her future plans. The transfer of authority to Charles Gustave proceeds with surprising smoothness despite the unprecedented circumstances. You can observe how Christina's careful preparation enables the transition to unfold without the constitutional chaos that abdication might have triggered. Her cousin accepts the crown with visible emotion, clearly moved by both the honour and the burden being placed on him. The ceremony demonstrates that Christina's planning extended far beyond her personal escape to include genuine concern for Swedish political stability. Historians still argue whether Christina's abdication represented a carefully planned political strategy or an authentic expression of personal conviction. The evidence from this ceremony suggests both factors were operating. Her intellectual arguments show sophisticated political thinking, while her emotional demeanour reveals genuine relief at escaping roles that never fit her authentic self. You can see someone simultaneously destroying and fulfilling their royal duty through the very act of renunciation. The religious dimensions of the ceremony become apparent in Christina's subtle references to conscience and divine calling. You can detect hints of the Catholic theology that's been influencing her thinking, though she's careful not to reveal the full extent of her religious transformation. Her language about authentic service versus inherited obligation echoes Catholic teachings about individual spiritual vocation that transcend social expectations. The immediate aftermath of the abdication reveals the careful thought Christina put into managing the practical consequences of her decision. You can observe her remaining in the hall long enough to demonstrate that this isn't flight or abandonment but deliberate choice made for considered reasons. Her willingness to face immediate questions and reactions shows someone confident in their decision rather than someone escaping in panic or shame. The symbolic power of the moment extends beyond Swedish political significance to challenge fundamental assumptions about hereditary authority throughout Europe. You can sense how Christina's voluntary renunciation of divine right undermines theoretical justifications for monarchical power across the continent. If queens can simply choose to stop being royal, what happens to the entire intellectual framework that supports hereditary government? The emotional dimension of the ceremony proves as significant as its political implications. You can see Christina's visible relief as she completes the formal transfer of authority, as if enormous psychological weight has been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her adult life, she's no longer carrying the burden of others' expectations about who she should be and how she should live. The personal liberation is almost tangible. The crowd's reaction evolves from shock through confusion to a kind of awed respect as they witness someone voluntarily sacrificing everything their culture values most highly. You can observe how Christina's dignity throughout the ceremony prevents her abdication from seeming like failure or weakness. Instead, it appears as an act of extraordinary moral courage that challenges everyone present to reconsider their assumptions about duty, authority, and authentic living. As the ceremony concludes and Christina prepares to leave the throne room for the last time as Sweden's queen, you can sense the historical magnitude of what you've witnessed. This isn't just political transition, it's the birth of a new kind of person, someone who chose individual authenticity over inherited authority and personal truth over social expectation. The woman who said no to marriage has just said no to everything else her world offered, and in doing so she's opened possibilities that no one had previously imagined. You find yourself in a dimly lit stable courtyard outside Stockholm as the first rays of dawn pierce the September morning mist, watching one of history's most extraordinary royal escapes unfold in complete secrecy. The woman who was Queen of Sweden just 3 months ago now stands before you dressed as a young nobleman, her blonde hair cropped short and hidden beneath a feathered hat, her feminine curves disguised by carefully tailored men's clothing. Christina has become Count Dona, a fictional persona that will carry her across Protestant Europe toward the Catholic sanctuary she's been secretly planning to reach for years. The transformation is remarkable in its attention to detail. You can observe how Christina has practiced masculine mannerisms for months, the way she walks with longer strides, keeps her hands clasped behind her back rather than folded demurely, and speaks in the slightly lower register that men of her social class typically employ. This isn't amateur theatrics. This is the carefully rehearsed performance of someone who's studied gender presentation with scholarly precision. Even her closest servants would struggle to recognize their former queen in this confident young aristocrat preparing to mount his horse. The practical preparations for Christina's flight reveal the same meticulous planning that characterized her abdication strategy. You can see her travelling party, carefully assembled to appear like a minor diplomatic mission rather than a royal escape. Her few trusted companions have been sworn to secrecy and provided with cover stories that will explain their absence from Stockholm. The luggage is deliberately modest, just enough personal effects to sustain a travelling nobleman, but nothing that would suggest the portable wealth of an exiled monarch. The psychological dimension of Christina's disguise proves as significant as its practical utility. You can sense her genuine relief at finally inhabiting an identity that feels authentic rather than inherited. For the first time in her adult life, she's presenting herself to the world as someone she chose to become rather than someone she was born to be. The masculine clothing isn't just disguise, it's liberation from the feminine roles that never fit her personality or inclinations. The route Christina has chosen for her escape demonstrates sophisticated understanding of European political geography. You can trace her planned journey southward through Protestant territories where Count Donor can travel without triggering the diplomatic incidents that Christina's presence would inevitably cause. She's avoiding major cities where foreign ambassadors might recognize her, instead following lesser roads through territories where a minor Swedish nobleman would attract minimal attention. The first days of travel reveal both the exhilaration and anxiety of Christina's new situation. You can observe her genuine joy at experiencing ordinary travel after a lifetime of royal processions, but also her nervous awareness that discovery could trigger international incidents. Her former subjects would view her escape as abandonment. Foreign powers would see opportunities for diplomatic manipulation, and Catholic authorities might hesitate to provide sanctuary if her arrival seemed to threaten Protestant stability. The quirky aspect of Christina's masculine disguise is how naturally it seems to suit her personality. You can see her engaged with innkeepers, fellow travellers, and local officials with the easy confidence of someone finally able to present their authentic self to the world. The intellectual conversations she strikes up with educated men along the route reveal someone liberated from the conversational constraints that typically limit interactions between the sexes in 17th century societies. The international implications of Christina's flight create ripple effects that she can only imagine as she travels. You can sense how European courts will react when news of her disappearance reaches diplomatic networks. Protestant powers will worry about Swedish stability and Catholic influence. Catholic authorities will calculate the propaganda value of receiving such a prominent convert while weighing the political costs of harbouring a fugitive queen. The personal becomes political on a continental scale. The religious dimension of Christina's journey intensifies as she moves closer to Catholic territories. You can observe her carrying carefully hidden Catholic texts that she studies during private moments in roadside inns. The theological preparation for her eventual conversion continues even as she navigates the practical challenges of maintaining her masculine disguise. Her spiritual transformation parallels her physical journey from Protestant North to Catholic South. The financial aspects of Christina's escape reveal careful long-term planning that ensures her survival as a private person. You can see how she's converted Swedish royal assets into portable wealth that doesn't depend on continued recognition of her former status. The gold and jewels hidden in her travelling bags represent freedom from the financial dependence that keeps most royalty trapped in their inherited roles, regardless of personal preference. Historians still argue whether Christina's escape represented calculated political strategy or desperate flight from impossible circumstances. The evidence from her journey suggests sophisticated planning combined with genuine psychological necessity. You can observe someone who's thought through the practical implications of her choices, while also feeling compelled by inner convictions that make continued royal life impossible. The gender implications of Christina's masculine disguise extend beyond practical concealment to challenge fundamental assumptions about identity and social roles. You can see her experiencing freedoms that 17th century women simply couldn't access. The ability to travel unescorted, engage in public intellectual conversations, and make independent decisions without male oversight. Her disguise becomes a form of social experiment that reveals the artificial constraints that typically limit female autonomy. The psychological toll of constant deception during the journey creates unexpected stresses for someone accustomed to royal honesty. You can observe Christina struggling with the need to maintain her false identity, even during casual conversations with fellow travellers. The mental energy required for perpetual performance adds exhaustion to what should be the liberating experience of finally living according to her authentic preferences. The landscape itself seems to reflect Christina's internal transformation as she travels from the familiar forests of Sweden toward unknown territories that will reshape her destiny. You can see her pausing occasionally to look back toward the homeland she's voluntarily abandoned, processing the emotional complexity of choosing exile over inherited privilege. The physical journey becomes a metaphor for the psychological distance she's creating between her past and future selves. The practical challenges of maintaining masculine disguise while managing female physiology create constant low-level anxiety that Christina handles with characteristic intellectual precision. You can observe how she's researched and prepared for every aspect of gender performance, from clothing that conceals feminine characteristics to voice training that makes her speech patterns convincingly masculine. The dedication to authentic presentation reveals someone who understands that half measures would invite discovery and disaster. The evolving relationship between Christina and her travelling companions reflects the unusual dynamics of this unprecedented journey. You can see how her servants struggle to adjust their behaviour towards someone who's simultaneously their former queen and their current male travelling companion. The social confusion creates moments of comedy that lighten the tension of what could otherwise be overwhelmingly stressful circumstances. The communication challenges of the journey reveal how completely Christina has severed her connections to official Swedish authority. You can observe her inability to use normal diplomatic channels or royal privileges that would ease travel, but also expose her location to those who might force her return. She's chosen to experience Europe as a private person rather than a political figure, accepting the practical difficulties that choice entails. As the journey progresses toward Catholic territories, you can sense Christina's anticipation building alongside her anxiety. The physical escape from Sweden represents only the first phase of a transformation that will ultimately involve religious conversion, cultural adaptation, and the construction of an entirely new identity. The woman who said no to marriage is in the process of saying yes to possibilities that no European queen had ever previously imagined. The most remarkable aspect of Christina's escape is how completely she's managed to reinvent herself through sheer force of will and careful preparation. You're witnessing someone literally changing their identity through geographical movement, gender performance, and spiritual transformation. The journey from Stockholm represents more than royal abdication. It's the birth of a new kind of person who chose authentic living over inherited expectation. You stand in the magnificent nave of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on a crisp November morning in 1655, witnessing one of the most politically explosive religious ceremonies in European history. The soaring columns and golden mosaics seem to glow in the candlelight as Christina of Sweden, no longer disguised as Count Dohna, kneels before the papal altar to formally renounce her Protestant faith and embrace Catholic Christianity. The irony is breathtaking. The daughter of the great Protestant warrior Gustavus Adolphus is about to deliver the ultimate propaganda victory to the very religious system her father died fighting against. The psychological transformation that brought Christina to this moment extends far beyond the theological questions you witnessed during those midnight philosophical gatherings in Stockholm. You can observe her face, serene and determined, as she prepares to speak words that will permanently sever her connection to everything her homeland represents. This isn't the desperate conversion of someone seeking political advantage, but the culmination of years of intellectual investigation that has led her to genuinely believe Catholic doctrine offers truth that Protestant theology cannot provide. The political ramifications of Christina's conversion create seismic shocks throughout European diplomatic networks. You can sense the collective panic in Protestant courts as news of the ceremony spreads across the continent. The symbolic value of Sweden's former queen, embracing Catholicism, undermines Protestant claims about the superiority of Reformed Christianity and provides Catholic powers with propaganda that money couldn't buy. The personal has become profoundly political in ways that will reshape European religious conflict for decades to come. The ceremony itself represents a masterpiece of Catholic theatrical presentation designed to maximize the conversion's propaganda impact. You can observe how carefully every detail has been orchestrated, from the magnificent setting to the presence of high-ranking church officials who serve as witnesses to Christina's transformation. Pope Alexander VII himself officiates, underscoring the extraordinary importance the Vatican places on receiving such a prominent Protestant convert. The theological dimension of Christina's conversion reveals the intellectual sophistication that characterizes all her major life decisions. You can listen as she publicly articulates her reasons for embracing Catholic doctrine, demonstrating mastery of complex theological arguments about authority, tradition, and spiritual truth. This isn't emotional religious experience but rational conclusion based on years of scholarly investigation. Her conversion represents the triumph of Catholic intellectual tradition over Protestant reliance on individual biblical interpretation. The quirky detail that most observers miss is Christina's insistence on wearing simple white robes rather than the elaborate ceremonial garments typically provided for royal converts. You can see her rejecting the papal offer of jeweled vestments, choosing instead clothing that emphasizes spiritual rather than temporal significance. The gesture reflects her characteristic rejection of inherited privilege in favor of authentic personal choice, even in the context of religious ceremony. The international intelligence networks monitoring Christina's conversion work frantically to assess its implications for European balance of power. You can imagine encrypted dispatches flying between Protestant capitals as diplomats calculate whether Christina's religious transformation might influence Swedish foreign policy or inspire other Protestant nobles to consider Catholic conversion. The fear isn't entirely unfounded. Prominent conversions have historically triggered broader religious and political realignments. The personal psychology behind Christina's conversion proves as complex as its political implications. You can sense her genuine relief at finally resolving the spiritual conflicts that have tormented her for years. Catholic emphasis on free will and personal spiritual development aligns with her psychological need for self-determination in ways that Protestant predestination never could. The conversion represents not just religious choice, but psychological liberation from theological frameworks that seem to deny human agency. The artistic and cultural dimensions of Christina's Catholic transformation reveal her vision for her post-royal life. You can observe her immediate involvement in the Roman intellectual circles that welcome her not as exotic former royalty, but as serious scholar capable of contributing to ongoing theological and philosophical discussions. The Catholic Church's tradition of intellectual inquiry offers her opportunities for meaningful engagement that Protestant Sweden's more austere religious culture couldn't provide. The financial implications of Christina's conversion create both opportunities and challenges for her new life in exile. You can see how Catholic powers provide financial support that enables her survival as a private person, but also how this dependence creates new forms of obligation that constrain her freedom in different ways than royal duty ever did. The patronage system that supports her new identity comes with expectations that she must carefully navigate to maintain her hard-won autonomy. Historians still argue whether Christina's conversion represented genuine religious conviction or calculated political strategy designed to secure Catholic support for her exile. The evidence from the ceremony itself suggests authentic spiritual transformation combined with sophisticated understanding of its practical benefits. You can observe someone whose intellectual investigation has led to sincere religious conclusions, while also providing practical solutions to the problems created by royal abdication. The gender implications of Christina's Catholic conversion prove particularly significant in the context of Counter-Reformation religious culture. You can see how Catholicism's tradition of powerful female saints and religious leaders offers her models for influential life that don't depend on marriage or reproductive function. The conversion opens possibilities for meaningful existence that Protestant culture, with its emphasis on domestic feminine roles, never adequately provided. The linguistic challenges of Christina's religious transformation reveal her characteristic intellectual thoroughness. You can observe her conducting theological discussions in fluent Italian and Latin, demonstrating the language skills she developed during her secret Catholic investigations. Her ability to engage sophisticated theological arguments in multiple languages impresses church officials, while proving that her conversion stems from genuine understanding, rather than superficial attraction to Catholic ceremonial pageantry. The immediate aftermath of the conversion ceremony reveals both the opportunities and constraints of Christina's new religious identity. You can see her welcomed into Roman intellectual society while also closely monitored by church authorities who want to ensure their prominent convert remains theologically orthodox. The freedom she gained through abdication becomes qualified by new forms of religious oversight that she must learn to navigate carefully. The propaganda value of Christina's conversion extends beyond immediate European political concerns to influence Catholic missionary activities worldwide. You can sense how her example will be used to encourage conversions among Protestant populations across Europe and in colonial territories where religious competition shapes political control. The former Queen of Sweden has become an unwitting weapon in global religious warfare. The psychological impact of the conversion ceremony on Christina herself proves as significant as its external implications. You can observe her visible sense of completion as she formally embraces religious identity that aligns with her authentic beliefs. The spiritual transformation represents the final piece of the personal revolution that began with her intellectual awakening during those midnight philosophical discussions in Stockholm. The social dynamics of Christina's new position in Roman society reveal the complex negotiations required for someone creating an unprecedented social role. You can see her learning to function as a prominent Catholic intellectual while managing the curiosity and expectations that surround her unique background. Former queens who become private Catholic converts have no established social protocols to guide their integration into new communities. The theological implications of Christina's conversion extend beyond personal religious choice to challenge Protestant assumptions about spiritual authority and individual salvation. You can observe how Catholic intellectuals use her example to argue for the superiority of ecclesiastical tradition over private biblical interpretation. Her conversion becomes a case study in theological debates that will influence European religious thought for generations. As the ceremony concludes and Christina emerges from St. Peter's as a newly confirmed Catholic, you can sense the magnitude of the transformation she's completed. The journey from Protestant Swedish queen to Catholic Roman exile represents more than religious conversion. It's the creation of an entirely new form of European identity that transcends traditional categories of nationality, social status, and gender expectation. The woman who said, No to marriage has now said yes to spiritual possibilities that will reshape both her own destiny and European religious culture. You find yourself in the lavishly appointed salons of 17th century Rome, where Christina has established herself not as a royal exile mourning lost power, but as a formidable intellectual force creating an entirely new kind of social institution. The morning light streams through tall windows as Europe's most educated minds gather around tables laden with manuscripts, musical scores, and scientific instruments. This isn't nostalgic recreation of Swedish court life. This is something unprecedented, a kingdom of ideas ruled by merit rather than birth, where the former queen has transformed herself into Europe's most influential cultural patron. The physical space of Christina's Roman residence reflects her revolutionary approach to post-royal identity. You can observe how she's deliberately arranged her palazzo to encourage intellectual equality rather than hierarchical deference. Scholars sit wherever they find space, regardless of social rank. Conversations flow naturally between topics without ceremonial interruption. The furniture itself seems chosen to promote discussion rather than display status. Comfortable chairs arranged in circles, well-lit reading areas, intimate spaces that encourage honest intellectual exchange rather than formal presentations. The diversity of Christina's intellectual circle reveals her determination to create something that transcends traditional European cultural boundaries. You can see Italian composers working alongside German philosophers, French mathematicians debating with Spanish theologians, English natural scientists collaborating with Swedish linguists. The conversations switch effortlessly between languages as participants chase ideas across linguistic barriers. Christina herself serves as linguistic bridge, translating complex arguments to ensure everyone can participate regardless of their native tongue. The most remarkable aspect of Christina's cultural transformation is how completely she's redefined the relationship between power and influence. You can observe her wielding enormous intellectual authority without any formal political position, shaping European thought through patronage and conversation rather than governmental decree. Her recommendations can make or break scholarly careers. Her support can fund revolutionary research. Her salon can establish new philosophical movements. She's discovered that cultural power might be more lasting than political authority. The artistic dimension of Christina's new life reveals her sophisticated understanding of how culture shapes political consciousness. You can see her commissioning works that subtly challenge traditional assumptions about monarchy, gender, and religious authority. The paintings adorning her walls depict strong women from classical mythology and Christian history. The musical performances she sponsors explore themes of personal liberation and authentic choice. Even the architectural modifications to her residence seem designed to demonstrate alternatives to conventional expressions of power and status. The scientific investigations supported by Christina's patronage push the boundaries of acceptable intellectual inquiry in ways that would have been impossible during her royal years. You can observe natural philosophers conducting experiments that challenge Aristotelian physics, astronomers making observations that support Copernican cosmology, anatomists performing dissections that advance medical understanding. Her protection allows scholars to pursue research that more conventional patrons might consider dangerous or inappropriate. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's psychological adaptation to her new role is her habit of serving refreshments personally to her scholarly guests. You can watch her moving through gatherings with wine and delicacies, creating an atmosphere of domestic intimacy that breaks down social barriers between patron and beneficiary. The gesture transforms intellectual patronage from hierarchical relationship into collaborative community, reflecting her rejection of inherited privilege in favor of earned respect. The financial mechanics of Christina's cultural enterprise prove more precarious than the intellectual brilliance of her salons might suggest. You can see her struggling to maintain the lifestyle necessary for effective patronage, while living on the uncertain financial support that Catholic powers provide for her exile. The letters she writes seeking additional funding reveal someone walking a careful line between grateful dependence and dignified independence, trying to secure resources for her cultural projects without compromising her hard-won autonomy. The political implications of Christina's intellectual leadership create subtle but significant influence on European thought that extends far beyond her Roman residence. You can trace how ideas developed in her salons spread through informal networks to influence policy discussions in major capitals. Her conversations about religious tolerance affect diplomatic negotiations. Her support for scientific research influences university curricula. Her philosophical investigations shape theological debates that impact international relations. The gender dynamics of Christina's cultural position prove particularly fascinating in the context of 17th century European society. You can observe how her unique status as former queen allows her to transcend normal restrictions on female intellectual authority, while her Catholic conversion provides religious justification for her unconventional lifestyle. She's not just participating in European intellectual culture, she's reshaping it by demonstrating that serious scholarship doesn't require masculine identity or institutional position. Historians still argue whether Christina's Roman cultural activities represented authentic intellectual passion or calculated attempt to maintain relevance after losing political power. The evidence suggests both motivations operate simultaneously. She genuinely loves learning and discussion, while also understanding that cultural influence offers the best available substitute for the political authority she voluntarily abandoned. You can observe someone who's found meaningful purpose in intellectual leadership even as she occasionally mourns the simpler forms of power she gave up. The international dimension of Christina's cultural influence reveals how effectively she's managed to remain politically significant despite her official exile from European power structures. You can see foreign diplomats and travelling nobles making pilgrimages to her Roman salons, seeking her opinions on matters ranging from theological controversy to military strategy. Her informal authority proves more durable than many formal governmental positions, suggesting that intellectual influence might transcend the political limitations that exile typically imposes. The religious complexion of Christina's cultural activities reflects her sophisticated understanding of how to navigate Catholic intellectual traditions while maintaining the independent thinking that characterized her Protestant education. You can observe her supporting theological investigations that push the boundaries of orthodox interpretation without crossing into heretical territory. Her salons become spaces where Catholic and Protestant scholars can engage controversial questions that official religious institutions would find too dangerous to explore. The economic impact of Christina's patronage extends beyond individual scholarly careers to influence broader European intellectual development. You can trace how her financial support enables research that wouldn't otherwise find funding, how her cultural events create networks that facilitate collaborative investigation, how her recommendations shape university appointments and publishing decisions across Catholic Europe. The woman who abandoned political power has discovered cultural influence that affects European intellectual life more broadly than many governmental policies. The psychological dimensions of Christina's cultural transformation reveal someone who's found authentic fulfillment in ways that royal duty never provided. You can observe her genuine excitement during intellectual discussions, her obvious pleasure in facilitating scholarly collaboration, her satisfaction in seeing ideas she's supported influence broader European thought. The cultural activities aren't compensations for lost political power, or they're expressions of intellectual passions that royal obligations had forced her to suppress. The social innovations of Christina's Roman lifestyle challenge traditional assumptions about how former royalty should behave in exile. You can see her creating new forms of aristocratic identity based on intellectual merit rather than inherited status, cultural contribution rather than political position. Her salon becomes a model for alternative approaches to elite social organization that prioritizes learning over lineage, achievement over ancestry. The most significant aspect of Christina's cultural leadership is how completely she's managed to reinvent herself without betraying the intellectual integrity that motivated her original rejection of royal expectations. You can observe someone who's found ways to exercise meaningful influence while living according to authentic personal values. The Queen Without a Kingdoms has become something more interesting than most queens with countries, a cultural force who shapes European intellectual development through the power of ideas rather than the authority of armies. As you watch Christina moving through her Roman salon, engaging scholars in discussions that will influence European thought for generations, you realize you're witnessing the successful completion of one of history's most radical personal transformations. The woman who said no to marriage has created a life of such intellectual richness that traditional royal existence seems impoverished by comparison. She's not just surviving exile, she's demonstrating that authentic living can be more fulfilling than inherited privilege. You slip into the shadowy corners of Christina's Roman palazzo during the moonlit hours when whispered conversations take on the intimate intensity that daylight scholarship cannot provide. The flickering candlelight reveals a different side of the former queen's exile, one where intellectual companionship has blossomed into passionate attachments that scandalize even the sophisticated Roman society that welcomed her conversion. Tonight, you're witnessing the emotional complexities that arise when someone who rejected conventional marriage discovers alternative forms of love that challenge 17th century assumptions about appropriate relationships between the scenes. The most prominent of Christina's rumoured romantic entanglements involves Cardinal Deccio Azzolino, a brilliant theologian whose conversations with her have evolved from scholarly discourse into something that teeters dangerously close to forbidden intimacy. You can observe their late-night discussions about mystical theology and spiritual transcendence, taking on undertones that would horrify church authorities if they understood the emotional subtext. The irony is exquisite. The woman who fled marriage to maintain her independence has found herself emotionally entangled with someone whose clerical vows make conventional relationship impossible. The complexity of Christina's attachment to Azzolino reflects her characteristic approach to transcending social boundaries through intellectual rationalization. You can see her crafting sophisticated theological arguments about spiritual friendship that justify intense emotional connection, while theoretically maintaining appropriate religious boundaries. Their correspondence, conducted in multiple languages and filled with classical allusions, reads like love letters disguised as scholarly exchange. The intellectual passion serves as both authentic communication and necessary camouflage for feelings that neither can officially acknowledge. The social dynamics surrounding Christina's unconventional relationships reveal how her unique status as former queen creates unprecedented social complications. You can observe Roman society struggling to categorize someone who exists outside traditional frameworks for understanding female behavior. Is she a royal exile deserving special consideration? A prominent Catholic convert requiring careful oversight? A dangerous independent woman whose example might encourage other females to reject conventional expectations? The uncertainty creates space for relationships that wouldn't be tolerated if Christina occupied a more clearly defined social position. The rumoured affair with the French ambassador, the Marquis de Monaldeschi, demonstrates the dangerous political implications of Christina's romantic entanglements. You can watch their relationship unfold as a complex mixture of diplomatic necessity, intellectual attraction, and physical passion that threatens to compromise her carefully maintained independence. The ambassador's position gives him access to Christina's private life, while his government's interests create potential conflicts with her personal desires. The personal and political become inextricably intertwined in ways that mirror the complications she originally sought to escape through abdication. The most shocking scandal erupts when Christina's relationship with Monaldeschi deteriorates into accusations of betrayal and conspiracy that culminate in violence that horrifies European court society. You can sense the mounting tension as their affair transforms from passionate romance into bitter conflict over political loyalty and personal honour. The discovery of secret correspondence suggesting Monaldeschi's duplicity triggers Christina's fury in ways that reveal the intense emotions hidden beneath her scholarly persona. The violent resolution of the Monaldeschi affair demonstrates that Christina's rejection of conventional feminine roles extends to embracing masculine concepts of honour and revenge. You can witness her ordering the execution of her former lover in her own palace, treating personal betrayal as a matter requiring deadly justice rather than heartbroken forgiveness. The decision shocks European society not just because of its brutality, but because it represents female authority exercised in traditionally masculine terms that challenge fundamental assumptions about gender and power. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's psychological approach to romantic relationships is her habit of conducting courtships primarily through intellectual correspondence rather than physical presence. You can observe her developing intense emotional connections with men she sees infrequently, building relationships on shared ideas rather than daily domestic interaction. The pattern suggests someone who finds mental stimulation more compelling than conventional romantic gestures, preferring passionate exchanges about philosophy to traditional expressions of affection. The aftermath of the Monaldeschi execution creates international diplomatic complications that force Christina to navigate carefully between maintaining her independence and avoiding complete social isolation. You can see her crafting explanations that frame the violence as necessary defense of honor, while downplaying the personal emotions that actually motivated her actions. The incident demonstrates how completely she's internalized masculine concepts of justice while creating unprecedented problems for someone whose survival depends on maintaining Catholic patronage. The religious implications of Christina's romantic scandals create particular difficulties for church authorities who have invested enormous propaganda value in her conversion. You can observe Vatican officials struggling to manage the contradiction between Christina's value as prominent Catholic convert and her tendency toward relationships that violate conventional religious expectations. Her emotional entanglements force church leaders to choose between public censure that would undermine her propaganda value and private tolerance that might encourage similar behavior among other prominent Catholics. Historians still argue whether Christina's rumoured affairs represented genuine romantic passion or strategic relationships designed to maintain political influence through personal connection. The evidence suggests both motivations operated simultaneously. She was capable of intense emotional attachment while also understanding how romantic relationships could provide access to information and influence that formal diplomatic channels might not offer. You can observe someone whose authentic feelings serve practical purposes even as they create dangerous complications. The psychological dimensions of Christina's romantic entanglements reveal someone whose rejection of conventional marriage doesn't eliminate her capacity for passionate attachment, but rather redirects it toward relationships that transcend traditional boundaries. You can see her drawn to men whose intellectual sophistication matches her own, seeking partnerships based on mental equality rather than hierarchical submission. The pattern suggests authentic emotional needs that conventional royal marriage could never have satisfied. The social impact of Christina's romantic scandals extends beyond immediate personal consequences to influence European discussions about female autonomy and appropriate relationships between the sexes. You can trace how her example both inspires and horrifies other women who observe someone successfully maintaining independence while engaging in passionate relationships outside marriage. Her behaviour becomes a case study in debates about whether female intellectual development inevitably leads to moral corruption. The financial implications of Christina's romantic entanglements prove as significant as their emotional and political consequences. You can observe how her relationships with wealthy and influential men provide access to resources that support her cultural activities while creating dependencies that compromise her autonomy in subtle ways. The economic dimensions of romantic attachment mirror the broader challenges she faces in maintaining independence while surviving in exile. The international intelligence networks monitoring Christina's personal life reveal how European powers attempt to exploit her romantic relationships for diplomatic advantage. You can see foreign agents trying to influence her through her lovers, using emotional connections to gather information or shape her political opinions. The personal becomes a battleground for international espionage, in ways that demonstrate the continued political significance of someone who officially abandoned all governmental authority. The most tragic aspect of Christina's romantic scandals is how they reveal the emotional costs of the independence she fought so hard to achieve. You can observe someone whose intellectual sophistication and social position make conventional relationships impossible, while her authentic emotional needs create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. The freedom she gained through abdication comes with isolation that passionate attachments temporarily relieve but ultimately cannot resolve. The cultural implications of Christina's romantic behaviour extend beyond individual scandal to challenge fundamental assumptions about female sexuality and appropriate expressions of desire. You can see her relationships becoming topics of artistic representation and literary exploration that influence European understanding of women's emotional capabilities and social possibilities. Her scandals contribute to broader cultural conversations about gender, power, and authentic human connection. As you observe Christina navigating the complex aftermath of her various romantic entanglements, you realize you're witnessing someone whose rejection of conventional marriage has led not to emotional sterility, but to forms of passionate connection that transcend traditional boundaries while creating unprecedented complications. The woman who said no to marriage has discovered that authentic emotional life might be more complex and dangerous than the conventional relationship she originally sought to avoid. You find yourself in the echoing halls of European palaces during the 1660s and 1670s, watching Christina orchestrate increasingly desperate schemes to reclaim political relevance in a world that has moved beyond her voluntary exile. The former Queen of Sweden, now approaching middle age, refuses to accept that abdication means permanent withdrawal from the great game of European politics. Instead, you're witnessing her transformation into something unprecedented, a freelance monarch offering her services to whoever might provide her with armies, territories, and the intoxicating return to real power that her Roman intellectual salons cannot fully replace. The most audacious of Christina's comeback attempts emerges when the Polish throne becomes vacant in 1668, creating an opportunity for someone with royal credentials to stake a claim through military force and diplomatic maneuvering. You can observe her in secret meetings with French agents, who see potential advantage in supporting a Catholic candidate with Swedish connections who might shift the balance of Northern European politics. The irony is delicious. The woman who abdicated to avoid the constraints of hereditary monarchy now seeks to acquire a different crown through calculated political intervention. The practical preparations for Christina's Polish adventure reveal her characteristic attention to detail combined with breathtaking ambition. You can see her assembling a small army of mercenaries, negotiating financial support from Catholic powers who view her potential kingship as strategic advantage against Protestant alliances, and developing propaganda campaigns that frame her candidacy as religious crusade rather than personal ambition. The woman who once renounced temporal power has become a master of the military and diplomatic art she originally rejected. The psychological dimension of Christina's political comeback attempts proves as fascinating as their practical implications. You can observe someone whose intellectual life in Roman exile, however sophisticated, cannot fully satisfy the hunger for direct influence that royal upbringing instilled. The scholarly patronage and cultural leadership that define her current existence feel inadequate compared to the immediate authority that governmental power provides. She's discovered that voluntary exile from politics doesn't eliminate political ambition. It merely redirects it toward more desperate and potentially dangerous channels. The French connection in Christina's Polish schemes reveals the complex international calculations surrounding her potential return to power. You can watch Cardinal Mazarin's successors weighing the advantages of supporting a Catholic candidate with Protestant Swedish origins who might serve French interests in Eastern Europe. Christina offers them something unprecedented, a royal convert whose political success would demonstrate Catholic superiority while potentially destabilizing Protestant alliances that threaten French expansion. The military dimension of Christina's comeback attempts showcases skills that few contemporary observers expected from someone known primarily for intellectual pursuits. You can see her studying fortification techniques, learning artillery placement, and mastering the logistics of early modern warfare with the same systematic approach she applied to philosophical investigation. The former queen has transformed herself into a competent military commander whose strategic thinking combines classical education with practical battlefield experience. The quirky aspect of Christina's political resurrection efforts is her insistence on maintaining intellectual standards even during military campaigns. You can observe her requiring her mercenary officers to participate in philosophical discussions during their rare, quiet moments, turning army encampments into mobile universities where strategic planning mingles with theological debate. The approach reflects her belief that political authority should be grounded in intellectual sophistication rather than mere military force. The financial challenges of Christina's military adventures reveal the precarious nature of her exile existence despite the cultural success of her Roman salons. You can see her constantly struggling to fund armies and diplomatic missions, while living on the uncertain support that Catholic patrons provide for her maintenance. The gap between her political ambitions and available resources forces her into increasingly risky alliances with supporters whose own motivations may conflict with her long-term interests. The diplomatic complexities surrounding Christina's comeback attempts create ripple effects throughout European international relations that extend far beyond her personal success or failure. You can observe how her mere presence as a potential candidate for various thrones forces established powers to recalculate their strategies. Protestant nations worry about Catholic expansion. Catholic powers compete for influence over her candidacy, and smaller states seek to exploit the instability her activities create. The religious implications of Christina's political schemes prove particularly complex, given her status as prominent Catholic convert whose success would have enormous propaganda value for counter-Reformation efforts. You can see church authorities caught between supporting activities that might advance Catholic political interests and worrying about associating Vatican prestige with military adventures that could fail spectacularly and embarrass the Church's judgment. Historians still argue whether Christina's comeback attempts represented realistic political calculation or desperate fantasy born from exile frustration. The evidence suggests both factors operated simultaneously. She possessed genuine political and military capabilities while also overestimating her ability to translate intellectual reputation into practical political support. You can observe someone whose previous success in radical personal transformation convinced her that equally dramatic political resurrection might be possible. The Polish campaign reaches its climax when Christina actually leads troops into battle, personally commanding forces that briefly threaten to establish her as serious contender for the vacant throne. You can witness her in full military regalia, sword in hand, directing cavalry charges with the same intensity she once brought to philosophical debates. The image of the former Swedish queen leading Catholic forces against Protestant opposition creates visual symbolism that reverberates throughout European political consciousness. The ultimate failure of Christina's Polish adventure demonstrates the limitations of individual ambition when confronted with established international systems that have adapted to function without her participation. You can see her forces gradually melting away as financial support disappears and political backing evaporates in the face of more conventional candidates with stronger institutional support. The woman who successfully revolutionized her personal life discovers that political resurrection requires resources and alliances that her exile cannot provide. The aftermath of the Polish failure triggers additional schemes as Christina refuses to accept that her political career was permanently ended. You can observe her exploring opportunities in Naples, investigating possibilities in various German principalities, and even considering ventures in distant territories where European politics might create openings for someone with her unique combination of royal credentials and military experience. The papal diplomatic adventures represent Christina's most sophisticated attempt to transform religious influence into political authority. You can see her working to position herself as unofficial Catholic representative in various European conflicts, using her conversion credentials to gain access to papal diplomatic networks while pursuing agendas that serve her personal political ambitions rather than purely religious objectives. The psychological toll of repeated political failures becomes increasingly apparent as Christina's comeback attempts grow more desperate and less realistic. You can observe someone whose earlier success in personal transformation has created expectations of continued revolutionary achievement that her changed circumstances cannot support. The gap between her self-image as someone capable of reshaping European politics and the reality of her limited practical influence creates mounting frustration. The most tragic aspect of Christina's failed political resurrection is how it reveals the emotional inadequacy of the intellectual life she's constructed in exile. You can see someone whose genuine love of learning and cultural patronage cannot fully compensate for the loss of direct political authority that royal upbringing taught her to value above all other forms of human achievement. The cultural influence she wields through her Roman salons feels insufficient compared to the governmental power she voluntarily abandoned. The international reaction to Christina's various political schemes reveals how completely European power structures have adapted to function without her participation. You can observe established monarchs and diplomatic networks treating her adventures as curiosities rather than serious threats, demonstrating that the political relevance she seeks to reclaim may no longer exist in forms she recognizes or can effectively pursue. As Christina's political comeback attempts gradually exhaust her resources and credibility, you can sense her approaching the realization that the revolutionary personal transformation she achieved through abdication cannot be repeated in the political sphere. The woman who successfully said no to conventional royal expectations is learning that saying yes to alternative forms of political authority may be beyond even her extraordinary capabilities for personal reinvention. You find yourself wandering through the increasingly cluttered galleries of Christina's Roman palazzo during the 1680s, where towering stacks of ancient manuscripts compete for space with exotic curiosities collected from every corner of the known world. The aging former queen, now in her 50s, has transformed her residence into something between a private museum and a chaotic library, accumulating treasures with the passionate intensity of someone determined to possess intellectually what she can no longer control politically. This is Christina's final metamorphosis, from failed military adventurer to Europe's most obsessive and brilliant collector of human knowledge. The sheer scale of Christina's collecting enterprise reveals both her continued intellectual vitality and her growing financial desperation. You can observe rooms filled with ancient Greek papyri rescued from monastic libraries, rare astronomical instruments purchased from impoverished scholars, and priceless artworks acquired through complex negotiations with debt-ridden aristocrats. Every surface displays artifacts that represent thousands of years of human creative achievement, but the magnificence cannot disguise the underlying chaos of someone whose acquisitive passion has exceeded her organizational capabilities. The psychological motivation behind Christina's collecting mania extends far beyond mere scholarly interest to represent a form of intellectual empire building that compensates for her lost political authority. You can see her treating each acquisition as a conquest, each rare manuscript as territory added to a kingdom of knowledge that exists entirely under her control. The books and artifacts cannot rebel, cannot reject her authority, cannot force her to choose between authentic self-expression and inherited obligation. In her library, she reigns absolutely over subjects that will never disappoint her expectations. The financial mechanics of Christina's collecting activities reveal someone living increasingly beyond her means, as her passion for acquisition outstrips the resources that Catholic patronage provides. You can observe her selling jewellery inherited from her royal past to purchase ancient texts, borrowing against future income to acquire scientific instruments, and engaging in complex barter arrangements with dealers who recognize her expertise while exploiting her desperate need for new additions to her collection. The intellectual dimension of Christina's late-life collecting demonstrates the same systematic approach that characterized her earlier philosophical investigations. You can see her developing expertise in fields ranging from ancient history to contemporary natural science, mastering enough specialized knowledge to identify truly significant acquisitions, while avoiding the forgeries and inferior copies that flood 17th century antiquities markets. Her collection becomes not just accumulation, but genuine contribution to European scholarly resources. The quirky aspect of Christina's collecting obsession is her habit of conducting elaborate cataloguing sessions, where she personally inventories every item while dictating detailed descriptions to secretaries who struggle to keep pace with her encyclopedic knowledge. You can watch her moving through galleries like a general reviewing troops, pausing to examine particular treasures while recounting their provenance and significance. The cataloguing becomes a form of intellectual performance that allows her to demonstrate the breadth of learning that conventional royal education could never have provided. The social implications of Christina's collecting activities create an unusual form of cultural influence that operates entirely outside traditional political or religious institutions. You can observe scholars making pilgrimages to her palazzo, to consult rare texts unavailable elsewhere, artists studying classical works that she's rescued from neglect, and scientists examining instruments that advance their experimental investigations. Her private collection becomes a public resource that shapes European intellectual development despite her official exile from formal authority. The international dimension of Christina's collecting network reveals how completely she's managed to transform personal passion into scholarly influence that transcends political boundaries. You can see her corresponding with collectors across Europe, negotiating acquisitions through agents in distant cities, and participating in informal scholarly networks that value intellectual contribution over political position. The woman who lost her kingdom has created an empire of knowledge that spans the continent. The religious complexities of Christina's collecting activities reflect her continued navigation between Catholic orthodoxy and intellectual independence. You can observe her acquiring texts that church authorities might consider dangerous, while maintaining the theological respectability necessary for continued Vatican support. Her collection includes works that push the boundaries of acceptable Catholic scholarship without crossing into explicit heresy, demonstrating her sophisticated understanding of how to pursue controversial knowledge within religious constraints. The artistic dimension of Christina's late-life passion reveals someone whose aesthetic sensibilities have been refined through decades of cultural patronage and international exposure. You can see her acquiring paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects that reflect genuine artistic judgment rather than mere status seeking. Her collection becomes a form of autobiography written in objects, each piece representing particular moments in her intellectual and emotional development. Historians still argue whether Christina's collecting obsession represented healthy intellectual engagement or pathological compensation for political disappointments. The evidence suggests both factors operated simultaneously. She genuinely loved learning and beautiful objects while also using acquisition to fill psychological voids created by her exile from traditional forms of achievement. You can observe someone whose authentic scholarly interest serves psychological needs that her earlier political and religious transformations couldn't fully address. The economic impact of Christina's collecting activities extends beyond her personal financial struggles to influence European markets for books, art, and scientific instruments. You can trace how her acquisitions drive up prices for particular types of objects while creating demand for scholarly services like translation, authentication, and restoration. Her passion becomes an economic force that supports entire networks of dealers, scholars, and craftsmen across Catholic Europe. The preservation implications of Christina's collecting prove more significant than her contemporary critics recognize. You can see her rescuing manuscripts from monastic libraries that would otherwise have been lost to neglect, acquiring artworks from aristocrats who would have sold them to less knowledgeable collectors, and maintaining scientific instruments that advance European understanding of natural phenomena. Her seemingly selfish accumulation serves broader cultural purposes that justify the financial excess it requires. The technological dimensions of Christina's collection reveal her continued engagement with cutting-edge scientific developments despite her advanced age and official withdrawal from political life. You can observe her acquiring the latest astronomical instruments, supporting experiments in natural philosophy, and commissioning mechanical devices that push the boundaries of 17th century engineering. Her library becomes a laboratory where theoretical knowledge meets practical application. The most poignant aspect of Christina's collecting years is how they reveal someone whose intellectual curiosity remains undiminished, even as her physical energy and financial resources decline. You can see her struggling with age-related limitations, while maintaining the passionate engagement with ideas that has defined her entire adult life. The collection becomes both monument to her achievements and compensation for the physical constraints that increasingly limit her activities. The legacy implications of Christina's massive collection create practical problems that she struggles to resolve as she contemplates her own mortality. You can observe her wrestling with questions about how to ensure her life's work will continue to benefit European scholarship after her death, negotiating with potential institutional inheritors, while worrying about preserving the intellectual accessibility that has made her collection so valuable to visiting scholars. The psychological satisfaction that Christina derives from her collecting activities proves more sustaining than her earlier political or romantic pursuits. You can see someone who has finally found a form of achievement that aligns completely with her authentic interests, while providing meaningful contribution to European intellectual culture. The library represents the successful resolution of conflicts between personal passion and public service that have defined her entire extraordinary life. As you observe the elderly Christina moving through galleries filled with the treasures of human civilization, you realize you're witnessing the final transformation of someone who has spent her entire adult life reinventing herself in response to impossible circumstances. The woman who said no to marriage has created something more lasting than dynastic succession, a collection that will influence European thought long after the political controversies of her reign have been forgotten. You stand at the threshold of history as the 17th century draws to a close, watching the extraordinary ripple effects of Christina's radical choice spread across European consciousness like stones cast into still water. The woman who shocked the world by saying no to marriage has become something far more significant than a royal curiosity. She's become a living symbol of the possibility that individuals can choose authentic lives over inherited expectations, that personal truth can triumph over social obligation, that human beings possess the power to reinvent themselves completely through acts of tremendous courage. The immediate legacy of Christina's abdication created precedents that fundamentally altered European understanding of royal authority and personal autonomy. You can observe how her voluntary renunciation of divine right inspired political theorists to question the philosophical foundations of hereditary monarchy itself. If queens could simply choose to stop being royal, what happened to the entire intellectual framework that justified inherited political authority? Her personal decision became a political philosophy that influenced Enlightenment thinking about individual rights and governmental legitimacy. The religious implications of Christina's conversion and exile proved equally transformative for European discussions about spiritual authority and personal conscience. You can see how her example encouraged other prominent Protestants to consider Catholic conversion, while simultaneously demonstrating that religious transformation didn't require abandonment of intellectual independence. Her sophisticated theological writings and patronage of Catholic scholarship showed that conversion could represent intellectual advancement rather than spiritual submission, opening possibilities for religious change that transcended political calculation. The gender implications of Christina's choices resonated through European culture in ways that extended far beyond immediate political consequences. You can trace how her rejection of conventional feminine roles inspired other aristocratic women to pursue education, engage in intellectual patronage, and assert forms of authority that didn't depend on marriage or reproductive function. Her example didn't create feminism, but it provided a powerful demonstration that women could exercise meaningful influence through intellectual achievement and cultural leadership. The psychological model that Christina's life represented proved perhaps most significant for future generations of individuals struggling with conflicts between authentic self-expression and social expectations. You can observe how her story became a template for personal transformation that emphasized rational choice over inherited obligation, individual conscience over collective pressure, authentic living over conventional success. She demonstrated that human beings possess the power to recreate themselves completely if they were willing to pay the enormous cost that such transformation required. The quirky detail that reveals Christina's lasting influence is how completely her story has been mythologized by subsequent generations who use her example to justify their own rebellions against social conventions. You can see her transformed into everything from feminist icon to religious convert to intellectual pioneer, with each interpretation emphasizing different aspects of her choices, while sometimes losing sight of the complex individual who actually made those extraordinary decisions. The intellectual legacy of Christina's cultural patronage extended far beyond her personal lifetime, to influence European scholarly development in ways that are still being discovered by modern historians. You can trace how manuscripts she preserved, scholars she supported, and ideas she championed shaped everything from scientific investigation to artistic expression to theological speculation. Her Roman salon became a model for intellectual institutions that valued merit over birth, creativity over convention, authentic inquiry over inherited wisdom. The international diplomatic consequences of Christina's abdication continued to influence European politics decades after her death, as statesmen grappled with precedents she had established. You can see how her example complicated succession planning across European monarchies, forced diplomats to consider possibilities they had never previously imagined, and created new categories for understanding royal authority and personal choice that didn't exist before her radical decision. Historians still argue whether Christina's life represents triumph or tragedy, successful self-actualization, or destructive self-indulgence. The evidence suggests both interpretations contain partial truth. She achieved remarkable personal authenticity while paying enormous costs in terms of political influence, financial security, and emotional stability. You can observe someone whose extraordinary courage in pursuing individual truth created both inspiring possibilities and cautionary lessons about the prices that revolutionary personal choices inevitably demand. The economic model that Christina's exile represented proved particularly influential for understanding how cultural authority could operate independently of political power or inherited wealth. You can see how her transformation from royal ruler to intellectual patron demonstrated alternative forms of social influence that depended on personal achievement rather than institutional position. Her success in creating meaningful cultural impact without governmental authority inspired other exiled aristocrats and ambitious intellectuals to pursue similar strategies. The artistic representations of Christina's story reveal how completely her choices captured European imagination and provided symbolic vocabulary for discussing individual autonomy and social rebellion. You can observe painters, writers, and composers using her abdication as metaphor for everything from religious conversion to romantic liberation to political revolution. Her personal story became public mythology that transcended the specific historical circumstances that originally motivated her decisions. The educational implications of Christina's intellectual achievements influenced European discussions about female education and scholarly capability that extended far beyond immediate aristocratic circles. You can trace how her demonstrated mastery of classical languages, philosophical argumentation, and scientific investigation challenged assumptions about women's intellectual limitations while providing practical examples of what educated women might accomplish if given appropriate opportunities and institutional support. The psychological research potential that Christina's life represents continues to fascinate modern scholars interested in understanding individual resilience, identity formation, and the relationship between personal authenticity and social conformity. You can see how her systematic approach to personal transformation provides case study material for investigating how individuals successfully navigate conflicts between inherited expectations and authentic self-expression. The most profound aspect of Christina's legacy lies in how completely she demonstrated that human beings possess the power to recreate themselves through conscious choice rather than unconscious drift. You can observe how her methodical approach to personal transformation, intellectual investigation, careful planning, systematic execution provided a replicable model for individuals seeking to align their outer lives with their inner truths, regardless of social obstacles or practical difficulties. The continuing relevance of Christina's choices reflects how little fundamental human conflicts between individual authenticity and social expectation have changed despite centuries of political and cultural evolution. You can see how contemporary individuals struggling with similar questions about personal identity, social obligation, and authentic living continue to find inspiration in her example of someone who chose individual truth over collective approval, even when that choice required sacrificing everything her culture valued most highly. The spiritual dimension of Christina's transformation transcended specific religious conversion to demonstrate broader possibilities for personal renewal and authentic spiritual development. You can observe how her systematic approach to examining different religious traditions while maintaining intellectual independence provided a model for spiritual investigation that emphasized rational inquiry alongside emotional commitment, individual choice alongside institutional guidance. As the shadows lengthen and the candles burn lower in this final contemplation of Christina's extraordinary life, you can feel the gentle weight of history settling around her story like a comfortable blanket. The woman who said no to marriage ultimately said yes to possibilities that no one had previously imagined. Authentic living over inherited expectation, intellectual courage over social safety, personal truth over collective comfort. Her choices required tremendous sacrifice and created enormous costs, but they also opened possibilities for human flourishing that continue to inspire individuals seeking their own paths toward authentic existence. The peaceful resolution of Christina's story lies not in any single achievement, but in the cumulative demonstration that human beings possess remarkable capacities for self-transformation when they commit themselves to living according to their deepest truths rather than their inherited obligations. Her legacy whispers softly across the centuries, reminding each of us that we too have the power to choose who we become, that we too can say no to expectations that don't fit our authentic selves, that we too can create lives of meaning and purpose even when those lives differ dramatically from what others expect or approve. In choosing herself, Christina chose possibilities for all of us, and in that choice lies the quiet triumph that makes her story eternally relevant to anyone seeking the courage to live authentically in a world that often demands conformity over truth. Now let the soft whisper of history carry you gently toward rest as Christina's story fades into the peaceful darkness where all human struggles find their resolution. The candles have burned down to gentle glimmers. The conversations have quieted to contented murmurs, and the weight of centuries settles like a warm blanket around the extraordinary woman who chose truth over convenience, authenticity over approval, personal courage over inherited obligation. Her voice echoes softly across time, reminding you that tomorrow offers its own opportunities for authentic choice, its own possibilities for saying yes to who you really are beneath all the expectations others have placed upon you. Sleep now, and dream of the courage that lives within every human heart, waiting for the right moment to transform possibility into reality, to turn authentic desire into meaningful action, to choose the difficult path toward genuine fulfillment over the easy road of social conformity. Christina's story ends, but yours continues, and in that continuation lies all the hope and promise that her extraordinary example was meant to inspire. Rest peacefully, knowing that authentic living remains possible for anyone willing to pay its price, and wake refreshed to embrace whatever authentic choices your own life might offer. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and remember that saying no to what doesn't serve you is simply another way of saying yes to what does.